Hello friends and welcome back to Generation Pixel, and if you're new to the channel, well firstly thanks for clicking on the video, and secondly, well you're in for a treat because I'm about to talk about the internet in the 1980s.
Are you crazy? Is that your problem?
I'm not crazy!
And this is a topic that was inspired by a certain Mr. Jonathan Heiss from back in the day gaming. Now I know a lot of you are out there thinking there was no internet in the 80s, and I suppose technically you're right, but if you want to see what I'm talking about, you just wait until after these. So who really cares that we didn't have the internet in the 1980s, because we had something a bit more special than that, and that was gaming magazines. And the first one I'm going to have a look at is Crash magazine for the ZX Spectrum, published in 1986, sporting the wonderful arcade port Mikey on the front, and I really loved this artwork because that's exactly how I looked in 1986. Now, very much like the modern day internet, the first thing that you're going to encounter is a pop-up ad. But when pop-up ads look this good, you just didn't complain. We don't get pop-up ads like this. I don't know whether it's a cultural thing or not, but look at that wonderful classic art on display. It's just jaw-dropping. And tell me who wouldn't want to rush out and buy The Legend of the Amazon Woman in the ZX Spectrum after seeing that. Next up, of course, we have the search engine, because yes, we would read this cover to cover, but we would want to know how to quickly get to the content that we were after, and that's what this page here was all about. No typing into Google, just going straight to the page you want. And magazines were much more friendly than the internet. The people behind them, especially the editor, they wanted to welcome you to the magazine and maybe have a little foreword, much like this one here, or even put out a special announcement crying for help. And it wasn't just about the games, there was also gaming news stacked into these wonderful magazines, whether it be things about new software developers opening up, or even the Microgen National Computer Games Champion. I mean, wonderful little pieces. But what we were really here for were the new games on release. Games like Mikey in this example, because we didn't have the access to information that we do have these days, and craved absolutely every morsel that we could get our hands on. And that included not only the games we knew were coming out or were already out, but games that we had no idea were out, or games that were still to be released. Every piece of information, even if it was a cricket game, we sucked it all in. Come on people, it's a sport that was created that stops for tea. And if you think the gaming press or the internet lies to us today, just look at that. They didn't even put a screenshot up for the game for V. They just put up some of the TV show advertisements. That's genius. But of course, the main bread and butter of these magazines were the reviews, and the beauty of these reviews were they were in your hand. You didn't have to rely on an internet connection, you didn't need Wi-Fi, you didn't need your mobile phone to hand. These things were physical and in your hand, and they went into depth. Yes, you would get screenshots, but you would get a lot of commentary on them, written by people who usually had played the game, but more importantly didn't mind calling that game out if it needed to be called out. And I think part of the reason for that is that any negative response, any negative feedback that came from such reviews, well, it wasn't instant, it wasn't on the reviewer straight away. They had at least a month before mail would start coming in, and by that time we would have moved on to the next hot topic. But on the flip side of that coin, it was there in black and white, physically in your hand, so if someone had been totally out of line, there was absolutely no way to cover that up, take it down off the internet, and pretend it was all just a forged hoax. And we might not have had Twitter back in the day, but we certainly had comments from readers, which in many ways is just proto-Twitter, because people did write sackfuls of letters to these magazines, commenting on what they'd seen in the previous edition, or even just bringing up hot topics of that current era. And yes, I'm well aware that at least the editor would have some sort of control over which letters were published. That doesn't mean some of the more heated ones didn't get through, even if that was just for a laugh on behalf of the magazine. On numerous occasions I took great joy in reading letters from readers that absolutely roasted the reviewers from a previous magazine, as well as some of the hilarious responses the magazine itself would put out in defence of some of these more inflammatory comments that came their way. Now, at the beginning of the video I did crack a little joke about pop-up ads, but in all fairness, advertisement was such an important thing to the magazine, any magazine. It wasn't just the cover price that generated the income that they required to put these magazines out. No, they had to sell space to advertisers. Now, the difference obviously between modern day internet and the magazines that we relied on back in the day was the fact that the ads that you saw in the magazines were relevant to the magazine you were reading. So rather than just being there to help fund the magazine itself, it was also a part of the entertainment of the magazine. It was a nice symbiotic relationship between the magazine and the people buying the advertising space. Because yes, obviously the people who were buying ad space were looking directly at the market that were buying these magazines, and the content that they were advertising was the very same thing that the magazine would be talking about and reviewing itself, which in my humble opinion is a stark difference between what we get now on the internet, regardless of what topic we're surfing for at any given time. And let's face it, in the 80s the ads in these video game magazines truly are a thing of beauty. They're a work of art in their own right, and although a lot of things have moved on quite drastically since the 80s, some for the better, personally I don't think we've ever recaptured that coolness that was in the 80s that sort of died off in the mid 90s. So it's nice just to flip through these old pages and just see where we were at that point in history. And to wrap up this segment, let's just take one more look at the legend of the Amazon women. And why? Well, just because it's the legend of the Amazon women. And I really want to play this game now. So, advertisers, well done. So there you go my friends, that was my take on the internet in the 1980s. And yes, I did take a few liberties because there was no internet in the 1980s. But between you and me, the magazine beats the internet hands down. And we just don't see enough of it these days. Now I don't know if we'll ever get back to the heyday of the 80s and the early 90s, but we can always cross our fingers. Now if you want to talk about anything that you've seen today, then drop that down in the comments, because the interaction between you and me, well, that's what makes YouTube special. Well, it does for me anyway. And while I'm winding up this video, I'm going to wind it up in style and read my latest magazine. So, until next time, cheerio!